All right, now we're taking a look at our narrower binding here. If you'll take a look at this screw, you can see it's almost all the way to the base of this slide area, just a little bit further out. And again, I've got these two sides adjusted evenly. This side is flat and even with this. Later on, when we go to stitch in the ditch, we'll adjust this a little bit. I don't like you to start out with the narrower binding because it's harder to learn how this tool works. We talked about the groove. This groove now has very little space between here and here. So it's harder for you to pull the binding in here. Once you know how the tool works and how your fingers pop that binding back, you can go to a narrower binding. But the space that we have here is very limited. So you don't ever want to start with a 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 inch binding. I'm folding this over and again just giving this a little bit of a finger press here. Fold those mitered corners over. Of course, your whole project would be done at this point before you were starting this. Now when I place this on, what I want to look for is that this line is not with the binding sitting way under. You can see there. See how I've kind of forced it a little bit? If I had adjusted this much too small for a wider binding, or if my binding, if the screw was all the way down, it's going to be very hard for me to pull that binding back and get it into the groove. So you want to make sure that you give yourself enough space. Now when we take a look at this, you can see it's much narrower here, but again the binding is sitting tightly in the groove on the back side, and on the front the lock line is just barely there, and I actually could adjust it just a little bit. If you can see, it's very hard to see, but I call this deadly because this is so close, but it's just a little bit too big right there. If I went to stitch in the ditch, I'd catch the binding on the back, I'd miss the binding on the back. I'd catch the binding, I'd miss the binding.